Up to now, in the Soviet period, we've been dealing with writers who took the ideology of the regime and the whole business of revolution deeply seriously. In some cases, of course, particularly in the case of Mayakovsky, there was some humor. But nevertheless, in general, the fact of the revolution was something that was tremendously important and tremendously serious for them. Now we're coming to a writer whose work turned out to be undoubtedly the most popular writing in the entire Soviet period. His name is Mikhail Zoshchenko. And of course, he looks at the ideology and the whole thing as enormously funny, as material only for satire and for parody. And in a series of very short jabbing-type articles, he makes enormous comic fun of everything that the Soviets were trying to do and of the reality of Soviet society. Now, of course, to get away with this in a country like the Soviet Union, where they tried to control everything and wanted writers to write only what they were waiting for, was not such an easy matter. This kind of thing could easily get him into trouble, although, as a matter of fact, for something like 25 years, he managed to stay out of trouble. This testifies to a particular kind of talent, a particular kind of style, of which Zoshchenko was absolutely the master. He started out as a soldier in World War I, was the victim of a gas attack, which left him in rather shaky health throughout almost his entire career. Furthermore, he himself was something of a person who liked to be sick, or who considered himself sick, so that as an individual, he was a very special kind of individual. The way he managed to get away with these satirical and funny stories was by a use of a technique that was often used in Russian literature, that is, writing a story the way it would be told, in rough language, in slang language. By this time, of course, the Russian language had been burst open, the Russian literary language, that is, had been burst open by the revolution. All kinds of words that previously would never be on the page is now on the page. And, of course, his use of this slang, his use of these sometimes rude and rough words, together with an unerring ear for the absurdities of the ideological language, gave the stories a kind of an atmosphere, a kind of approach that people didn't entirely take seriously. And of course, he could claim that the attitude of the characters didn't represent what he thought. The attitude of the characters represented what certain people in Soviet reality did, but of course he was putting it on public view in order they could be corrected and improved, in order to criticize them, so that the reader should not take these characters as expression of his opinions, but rather opinions of which he was making fun, opinions which he was criticizing. And his readers, for the most part, were willing to go along with his claims, even the government readers, because, of course, the stories were very funny. They were very appealing, and, of course, very popular among the public. Perhaps one of his most touching and his best stories had to do with a broad public campaign against illiteracy in the USSR. Now, you understand that there are many genuine and legitimate criticisms that can be made about the Soviet regime, and I certainly have not hesitated to say that in the course of these lectures. But there is at least one thing the Soviet regime did which is simply a fact. It took a population which the Tsarist regime had deliberately kept in illiteracy for many hundreds of years, a population that was almost exclusively illiterate, and in 2 or 3 generations turned it into a population where the literacy rate was probably the highest in the world. That is, the education, the mass education of people under the Soviet regime was a remarkable achievement of the revolutionary regime. And of course, this was at least in part the result of many, many campaigns against illiteracy that were widely carried out throughout the Soviet Union. And it seems to me one could hardly argue with such campaigns. Surely a literate population, a population that in its mass is literate, is far better than an illiterate population. And yet, there are ways and ways of attacking the problem. Some of them, of course, exhibit a much greater degree of human sensitivity than others. And as you might imagine, many of the campaigns, even against illiteracy as they were run by the Soviet government, were done in a very, very crude way. This is illustrated in a story whose title is Pelageya. Pelageya is a rather simple woman's name, often used by peasants. It's derived from the Greek, and of course many, many very popular names among the peasants were derived from the Greek language. The very title indicates to you this is a very simple woman. This is a woman who was typical of people who came out of the peasantry and who were part of the mass of the Russian population as it existed in those times. This story was written in the 1920s, obviously 7 or 8 years after the revolution. And the very first sentence tells us something about it. Pelageya was an illiterate woman. She couldn't even write her name. But she had a husband who was a responsible Soviet official. And of course, by that very term, responsible Soviet official, Zoshchenko makes you feel the pompousness of the guy. Although he'd been a simple peasant, 5 years of living in the city had taught him an awful lot. Not only how to write his name, but a hell of a lot besides. It's clear what sort of a person Pelagier is married to. And, says Zoshchenko, he was very much embarrassed to have an illiterate wife. Pelagier, he said, you ought to learn how to read and write. You ought to learn at least how to write your name. My last name is an easy one, 2 syllables, Kuchkin. And you can't write it. It's awkward. Pelagier waved it aside. Oh, there's no use in my trying to learn it now, Ivan Nikolaevich. I'm getting years, my fingers are getting stiff. Why should I learn to make those letters now? Let the young pioneers learn it. I'll make it my old age just as I am. Well, he was a terribly busy man, of course, and he couldn't be bothered with wasting much time with his wife. He wagged his head as if to say, oh, Pelagiushka, but he kept his mouth shut. But one day he did bring home a special little book on the most up-to-date methods of teaching literacy. She turned it over in her hands. She said, look, lay it in the dresser, let it lie there. Maybe our grandchildren will have some use for it someday. But then, one day matters changed. She had to mend a jacket for Ivan Nikolaevich. The sleeve had worn through, so she took up her needle, and as she put her hand into the jacket, she heard something rustling. She investigated to see what the rustling was from, and lo and behold, she found a letter. A nice, clean one, with a neat envelope, precise little handwriting, and paper that smelled of perfume or even eau de cologne. Her heart gave a leap. Could Ivan Nikolaevich be deceiving me, she thought? Can he be exchanging love letters with well-educated ladies and making fun of his poor, dumb, illiterate wife? Of course, that was a bitter thing for her to have to say about herself. Well, she took out the letter. She looked at it this way. She looked at it that way, but she couldn't make out a word. For the first time in her life, she was sorry that she couldn't read. Even though it's somebody else's letter, she said, I've got to read it. Maybe it'll change my whole life. She started to cry and think, well, her husband had changed recently. He took better care of his mustache. He was dressing rather nicely. But she couldn't read the letter, and of course to show it to somebody else would be terribly embarrassing. So she pretended as if nothing had happened. In calm and even tone, she talked to her husband, even hinted that, she had nothing against study, maybe she was fed up with being a dark and illiterate peasant. Of course, again, it's rather bitter for her to have to say this about herself. And she stared fixedly at his neat, clipped little mustache. For 2 solid months, she undertook the painful job, especially for an adult, of learning how to read. It's one thing to learn how to read when you're young, quite different when you're an adult. But every time that she got discouraged, the scent of the perfumed letter spurred her on. But it was no easy job. It was a 3rd month before she mastered the art. One morning, she took the letter out of the dresser and started to read it. It was hard for her to decipher the small handwriting, but the scent of perfume again did it. The paper was addressed to Ivan Nikolaevich, and it read like this. Dear Comrade Kuchkin, the way communists write to each other, I'm sending you the primer I promised. I think that your wife should be able to master this vast erudition in 2 or 3 months. Promise me, old boy, that you'll make her do it. Explain to her. Make her feel how disgusting it is to be an illiterate peasant woman. To celebrate the anniversary of the revolution, we're liquidating illiteracy throughout the whole republic. Here you hear the language of the campaign. By all possible means. But for some reason, we forget those closest to us. Be sure to do this, Ivan Nikolaevich, with communist greetings, Maria Blokhina. And of course, the very name makes fun of her. Blokha in Russian is the name for flea. Pelagier read this letter through twice, then pressing her lips together sorrowfully and feeling somehow secretly insulted, she burst into tears. In this very simple story, Zoshchenko put together the common feeling of insult at the constant condescension of the Soviet government toward its own people, the unstated but always present notion that the authorities knew completely in all instances what was best for its people, regardless how these very people may think and feel. The fact that such feelings couldn't normally be expressed openly made their implied expression in the story all the more powerful. And of course, you have to understand what it felt like to live at that time when the government tried to control every single aspect of people's lives. when there was nothing that you could do, almost nothing that you could do in your life outside something very, very private that the government didn't try to affect in some way or push in some way or make you feel that you weren't doing it right, you should do it their way, not your way, and so on and so on. Of course, what it did was to increase the level of privacy of people. You had one or two friends, and boy, those friends had to be close, because if they weren't, they could tell on you to the government, you'd be in big trouble. The rows of friendship didn't go out very far. When a person was a friend, they were a very, very close friend. And of course, they resisted very strongly this ever-present desire of the government to control what you were doing. Zoshchenko wrote a whole series of stories touching on some of the most pressing everyday problems of everyday life. His comic approach, involving satire and parody on the common slogans of socialism, made the stories all the more delightful to his Soviet readers, who could see their own personal problems clearly mirrored in his tales. And of course, his ironic phrases quite often became the cliches of Soviet conversation. They understood very well, of course, what he was doing with this language. One of the most terrible and at the same time ubiquitous problems of Soviet existence was the ever-present housing shortage. You have to remember that in the early days of the revolution, there had been a tremendous amount of destruction in cities where there had been fighting, not to mention, of course, through the parts occupied by enemy troops during World War I. And there had been very, very little construction to replace what had been destroyed, so that the housing stock in the cities was very shaky and not at all adequate. And then, during the 1930s, the urban population grew enormously, since the Soviet government was embarked on a huge program of industrialization requiring many, many in-migrants from rural areas, so that housing space that could barely handle the population that was already there suddenly had to handle a population which doubled and sometimes even trebled the population in the city. And of course, at that very same time, resources couldn't be spared for much new housing, and the old housing stock was not at all well cared for. It became necessary for whole families to live in one or two rooms, and millions of people had to share kitchens and bathrooms in so-called communal apartments. Imagine what it felt like to live in a building where one bathroom was used by perhaps 20 or 30 families. This may sound like an exaggeration, but that's the way it was in those days. Not to mention the kitchen, where people had to take turns in preparing dinner, and of course each one had their own pots and pans. You can imagine the kind of human problems that this led to. Zoshchenko became a master at exploiting the changing human foibles that resulted from such circumstances. Imagine the souring of the population and having to live in housing like this. And remember, the Russian winter is very cold and very long, so people were cooped up in these apartments for many, many months at a stretch. In the process, he also caught the incredible agility shown by individual people who had to cope with living under such conditions. You know, it's one thing to be a hero on the battlefield, or a hero when the circumstances are set out in great heroic form. It's quite another thing to handle the petty, banal, everyday problems of existence when people were stacked up, virtually stacked up one against the other in these hideous communal apartments. One of his best-known sketches, written earlier in 1925, dealt with what he called in the title, The Crisis. It opens with a phrase about the author's heart starting to beat with joy. Why? He was walking down the street, and what made him feel tremendously joyful? He just noticed a load of bricks being carted through the streets. In other words, they were building some new kind of building, some new kind of housing. Imagine one's heart beating faster because you saw a load of bricks being dragged along the street. It gives you some idea of Soviet reality at that time. Even fantasizes about what it might mean. Just imagine a family to live in more than one room. The prospect seems totally delicious, but also totally unreal. Imagine what family life was like when the whole family had to live in one room, and imagine how even worse that got if there was a divorce in the family, which of course in those days happened rather often because people's lives had been disrupted. There wasn't the usual stability of society, so this caused a tremendous rate of divorce, and sometimes the divorced couple had to live in the same room, so they put a partition in the middle of the room, and one party lived on one side and one on the other.